The Empire Strikes Back. Some say this is the greatest movie of all time, and it's hard to imagine the original Star Wars without this incredible second act. But what if I told you it almost didn't get made? How did they take the most popular film at the time and create an even grander sequel? How did George Lucas make the impossible possible? Let's find out. So jump into the backseat of the Falcon, cause this ain't like Dustin Crops. You're listening to Han Talks First.
So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first.
Last week on the show, we learned about the origins of the Star Wars script, and how it came to be, and how George Lucas's writing process is. And today we're doing the same thing, but for Empire Strikes Back, or as they called it at the time, Star Wars Chapter 2. Back in 1977, George Lucas managed to negotiate full sequel rights and merchandising rights with 20th Century Fox for Star Wars. How he did it? I don't know. He's a great businessman. But there was one condition in that original Star Wars contract. If George Lucas could not start shooting The Empire Strikes Back no later than the first quarter of 1979, all of his ownership over Star Wars would revert back to 20th Century Fox. This meant that he had almost 18 months at most to write the screenplay, hire the cast and crew, reform his company ILM, secure studio space, scout locations, and accomplish all other pre-production chores that had taken 4 years with the original Star Wars. And if he missed his deadline, he would lose the most sensational property the movies had ever seen. So it's no secret that George Lucas is a mediocre writer. Some would say a awful writer, a god-awful writer. But he is a good storyteller. And Lucas himself found the writing process excruciating and the most daunting process of filmmaking. And he realized that this sequel could not endure the kind of radical draft-to-draft reimagining that made the first movie so successful, because he lacked what was one of the most important forms of currency, time. Before he thought that a sequel movie would get made, he actually commissioned a science fiction author named Alan Dean Foster to create a possible low-budget sequel to Star Wars, which was actually published as a novel under the title Splinter of the Mind's Eye in 1978. But anyway, after this book was written, George Lucas realized that he wanted to make actually a more ambitious story. So he scrapped the idea of making that novel into the sequel movie. But he was considering adapting the novel at one point, which is also very interesting to think about. Because he lacked the time, he was thinking about making this book into that story. And in another podcast in another time, we'll go over the events of that book and talk about what could have been The Empire Strikes Back. But today we're talking about George's vision. So George had a lot of ideas for The Empire Strikes Back. And a lot of the ideas for this movie came from several different sequences and ideas that he had mapped out for A New Hope, and the ideas that he scrapped from A New Hope. Some of those ideas were that of including a scene with a floating city, which we now know as Bespin. He also wanted to include an ice planet, which is now Hoth. He wanted to have a swamp planet, which is now Dagobah. He also wanted to resolve the romantic triangle between Luke, Leia, and Han. And one of the other big things was he wanted to have a cliffhanger of Han Solo being missing in action. So it's interesting to think that that idea was originally conceived for A New Hope when that movie wasn't really about Han Solo, but rather Luke Skywalker. So I'm glad he nixed it from that story so it could be presented in Empire, which paid off tremendously well. Now, these concepts were eventually realized to what was then known as Star Wars Chapter 2. When he realized he didn't have time for dedicating all of his attention to writing for Empire Strikes Back, George Lucas visited writing conferences where he would pitch his notes to science fiction writers. And at one of these science fiction book conferences is where he met Leah Brackett. Leah Brackett is one of the few women at the time to break into the male-dominated world of science fiction writing. She was hired to bring a more authentic, classic Hollywood approach to Star Wars. So after he hired her, in 3 months, she banged out the script for Empire Strikes Back and turned it into George Lucas. 3 months she wrote that thing. She was a huge fan of Star Wars, and after seeing George Lucas's notes, she was very interested in writing this next installment. And that's why she wrote it so quickly, because she loved the material. 1 month after she turned in her first script, George Lucas approached her to do rewrites. But by that time, a month later, she had been hospitalized, and she could not work on the final version of the script. A few days later, she died of cancer. So, unfortunately, she did not get to contribute anything else to The Empire Strikes Back. I will go over some of the things she brought into this movie that made it so legendary, because she's a very important part of this process this early on in the writing stage. George Lucas had to move on because he was on a time crunch and he had to deliver a final script very soon. So before he started off on his second draft, he wanted to fix some of the things that didn't meet his expectations in the first draft of the screenplay. Some of which included that he didn't think Vader's dialogue matched his character. I quote, he says it was too corny. He also thought the tone of that Star Wars Chapter 2 was all wrong and didn't match the original, and he thought it was going a little too classical Hollywood, which is kind of funny because those are kind of the parameters which he set for Leia Brackett to write, and then he wanted to go back and change all that. Now, I'm not saying George Lucas, hated this script. He actually really loved this script, and it influenced a lot of the things he added later on and developed from it. These are just a few of the main things that he wanted to focus on when going into his second draft. Now, some major changes that were in the second draft that didn't make it into the final piece, which I think are worth mentioning, are these as they follow. So one of the most interesting ones was Han Solo was actually going to have a much bigger role in Empire Strikes Back, and he was actually going to have a backstory. George Lucas had written in his second draft a backstory for Han Solo. Details I don't know, but we do know that it was a very big piece of this movie. And Empire Strikes Back was originally going to focus heavily on his relationship with Leia and be more of a romantic film about Han Solo and Leia Organa. Another fun fact that was going to happen in the second draft of Empire was we were going to learn about Han Solo's old pirate mentor who taught him everything he knew and who left him a secret mission during this film. Could have been related to Jabba. Again, the details on that I'm not familiar with. I could not find in any of my books, but it's interesting that this could have been... Honestly, there could have not been a story. George Lucas just could have written that down on paper. Very interesting stuff. Some of the other things that were big-time changes before the final draft, which appeared in this second one, was that Yoda was originally named Minch Yoda. And he looked a lot different as well. If you're interested in seeing what the original concepts for Yoda looked like, you can actually go and check in the Empire Strikes Back comic version. But the comic came out at the same time as the movie did, so they had to go off earlier concept designs of Yoda, and at the time it was Minch. And he looks more purple-gray, he's a lot uglier, and he looks like a troll. Like a little goblin troll. And I definitely prefer the one we have now, and obviously it went from Minch Yoda to just Yoda. Another major change was Lando was originally going to be a clone, and one of the bigger ones was Vader was actually not going to be Luke's father in The Empire Strikes Back. That vision hadn't been quite tuned right yet. Now, Leia Brackett is one of the people that influenced that idea and came up with that fantastic twist. But Vader was toying with it at this time still. He wasn't completely signed on, but he hadn't thrown it away completely. One of the very interesting things why he chose not to have Vader be Luke's father at this point was because he actually wanted Anakin Skywalker to appear in The Empire Strikes Back. In the second draft, it says that Anakin actually appears in a spiritual form to encourage Luke Skywalker to continue his training on Dagobah so he can defeat Darth Vader. That's kind of weird, isn't it? that originally he wanted Anakin Skywalker to be separate from Vader. Not only that, but also appear in the film as a Force ghost, helping Luke guide his way through. You know, what's funny is it only took George Lucas 2 months after Leia's first draft to turn in a second draft to the studio, which is actually pretty swift for considering George Lucas and his hating of the writing process. And his version streamlined Brackett's draft and pared the story back to something that was very close to its finished form, while also integrating critical new elements. You know, at this point, Han Solo's backstory was thrown away, and this is when he introduced Boba Fett as a character. And he introduced him so that he was able to have a cliffhanger ending for Han Solo at the end of the film. You know, one of the reasons why it was switched that Vader was going to be Luke's dad was because George Lucas thought it was too unnecessary for Luke Skywalker to have 3 mentors in one film. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, his father. So that's why he decided to go with Leia's original version of having Vader be Luke's dad. And making Vader his father not only tightens the script, but it brought new and truly mythic dimensions to the overarching narrative, which was pure genius if you ask me. Switching from a storybook-like tale of good versus evil to a complicated chronicle of temptation and redemption, it's genius. It's that mythological storytelling that we latch onto as people throughout time and history. And the major twist of this, you know, Vader being Luke Skywalker's dad of all people, was incredibly important to George Lucas to remain secretive. So much so that he actually left it out of the script that he gave to his actors and to Fox studio executives. They didn't even know. He even went as far as to not even inform Irvin Kershner, who was the director, about this scene for as long as possible. So even Irvin Kershner didn't find out until it was necessary for him to learn that fact about the film. Genius. Absolutely genius. The way he kept it secret so it could stay hidden, and he put out like false news, false spoilers to the news that Obi-Wan killed Anakin's dad or Luke's dad. Genius stuff. Kind of a side note here, you know, ever since the beginning, early days of this, George Lucas has always, you know, told the story that he thought of Star Wars as this huge 12-episode, you know, saga, space opera thing, and he wanted to do 3 different trilogies with 3 movies, or he wanted to do 12 movies, and blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't until this point, after his second draft was turned in, that he stopped referring to the Star Wars series as a group of 12 films, but actually as a trilogy. So it was in 1978 that it was confirmed that this was going to be a 3-movie saga. Now, the reason why he chose 12 chapters at the beginning was because that was the number of Hollywood serials at the time, which he based Star Wars off of. But it was nice to see that he had a plan at this point of where this story was going to end, and that would be this movie's predecessor. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Be sure to come back tomorrow to hear part 2 of The Making of The Empire Strikes Back, where we're going to talk about the new writer George hired, Lawrence Kasdan, the creation of Yoda, and so much more. I hope you enjoyed the video today. I want to know what your favorite part was, so leave it in the comment section below. And if you're one with the Force, please like the video down below, and we'll be back with some more Star Wars very soon. Now, somehow, someway, somewhere this week, may the Force be with you.